right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. Wow, I know everyone is saying that, but maybe it's because I'm an inch taller. This is super bright. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming to my talk. The slides are uploaded on that URL if you want to follow along, but you can also check them out afterwards. I want to kick things off with a kind of important message, and that's that you're all wasting your time learning frameworks. Because we got web APIs, and so we have web components and other things, and there's really no need for any kind of frameworks. But before I'm getting kicked off stage, I know this statement is not 100% true, and the story is much more complex, but I think I got everyone's attention now, and I got an excuse to use the confetti animation in Keynote, so that's great. So I'm Dominik. I work as a developer evangelist at Twilio. And if you don't know about Twilio, we're a cloud communications platform. So we have a bunch of different APIs that allow you to do things like sending and receiving SMS, doing phone calls, video, and a bunch of other things. And I'm also a React developer. I love building with React. It's a great framework for a lot of the things that I build as demo apps. I'm also an Angular developer. I developed with Angular for quite a while. I love using web components because I think there's a good use case for them. I build things for the front end and the back end, and I love playing around with hardware as well, so I'm a hardware developer as well. But if people ask, I describe myself as a JavaScript developer because all of the things that I talked about, I see much more frameworks and libraries as tools rather than anything else. And tools are here to solve problems. And these problems might change over time, based on my team, based on the project, based on the time that, overall that I have for a project. And that gets me back to the statement of you're wasting your time learning frameworks, because while I don't believe it, I think it was a good generalizer to get your attention. And we probably all heard or said something like this, which is you're wasting your time learning X because Y exists already, or because Y is faster for some reason, or Y is better just generally because I saw some benchmark saying that. Or it's just because Y is more popular and I see it more often on my Twitter feed. And so I wanted to go back and talk about why we have frameworks in the first place. And that is to solve problems. As I said, any framework or tool is ultimately there to solve a specific problem. And if you don't believe me, I wanted to go back in history and kind of talk about a couple of things from the web development history and the tools, how they've developed over time. And note that I'll be talking about a couple of things, but those are definitely not all of them. And there's more things that evolved over time. But those are some things I personally interacted with, so I felt most connected to those. And so I want to start off with jQuery. I think we've all interacted at one point with jQuery, regardless of how long you've been doing web development. And I wanted to figure out why does jQuery exist in the first place. And it's actually pretty easy to figure out because if we go to the website, there's literally a section that is called What is jQuery? And it talks about that jQuery is an easy-to-use API that works across a multitude of browsers. And that might seem normal these days where we require everything to just work in every browser. But in 2006, when jQuery was released, we're in the middle of the browser wars. Firefox 2 was just released. Internet Explorer 7 was just released, and according to Wired, it was not as standards compliant as people had hoped for. Chrome was not on the market. There were Opera and Safari, and a couple of others like Camino, Flock, and Browser were sort of the other ones that were on the radar. So jQuery's goal was really to provide a unified access to the DOM and web requests. And if you're not sure why that seemed to be a problem, this is how you had to attach an event in 2006. You had to check if add event listener actually exists because that didn't exist in Internet Explorer, but hey, they had attach event. So you could use that instead. And so jQuery gave you a unified way of using the on method to actually access or set an event handler. And similarly, if you wanted to do a web request, you had to check if you're in IE6 and get an ActiveX object to do an HTTP request. And then you had to write all this boilerplate, and Ajax just streamlined that process for you. And so with better access to the DOM, we ended up building more applications that are UI heavy from a JavaScript perspective. And so we found the need for having more complex user controls, like date pickers, for example. And so projects like jQuery UI came around to have an ability to teach you, to share and build reusable components like date pickers, accordions, and other things, so you can build them into application. And so we all jumped on that and kind of started building more complex user interfaces for the browser. And so our need for tools to structure more complex applications grew. And so we got tools like Backbone that literally focused on giving your application structure to introduce models and views and things like that. But at the same time, some people didn't feel really comfortable with the fact that basically all of our document structure moved into JavaScript. And so some people wanted to go back to a more declarative way of describing UIs rather than imperative through JavaScript, which caused the creation of frameworks like AngularJS, which focuses on extending the HTML vocabulary to allow creating dynamic views in a declarative way rather than having to write a bunch of JavaScript statements. And as our code bases grew, we needed to have ways to handle that. Concatenating JavaScript files was not the only, the best use case anymore. And so we came up with module syntax like require.js, or bundlers, that came like Browserify and Webpack later, etc. And as people kept on developing those solutions and platforms developed, our problems kept on changing and new frameworks and tools showed up. So by now we got flooded with different frameworks that could handle different use cases. And so I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that all of these tools were created because people had problems and wanted to find a way to solve these problems. They got together with others and built these solutions. But building a framework is very much more of a life cycle. So while some gain mainstream popularity, others often kind of stay as like niche solutions. And additionally to that, we often have some that just disappear over time for various reasons. For example, jQuery kind of went away out of the spotlight because we moved into standards that solved exactly these problems. So we have query selector and add event listener now to solve a lot of the common kind of DOM accessing problems. And we have tools like fetch that don't require us to use Ajax or something anymore to have a kind of cross-platform thing. But while standards might solve a problem, I also have to disappoint you because if your favorite solution gets standardized, it does not necessarily mean it gets standardized the same way. Because standardization is hard and it has to take into consideration a lot of different aspects because it has to solve the problem for everyone and not just a share of folks. And the best way to explain how standards are being developed these days is with the Extensible Web Manifesto. If you haven't heard of the Extensible Web Manifesto, it's a manifesto that was written by a bunch of folks that are involved with standardizing browser features to kind of guide what kind of things should be standardized in the browser. And it focuses on 4 key concepts. The first one is that it focuses on adding new low-level capabilities to build the web platform that are secure and efficient. So what that means is if we look at things like WebGL, for example, or features like now I have a hanger. Webassembly. If you look at Webassembly or WebGL, those are very low-level things that we can build tools on top like A-Frame or 3JS to use them. But it's also that they should explain existing features. So that's a good example for things like the Houdini API or the web component spec, because they explain how the browser already handles CSS or introduces new components. And so it just exposes those to the outside. And then the other 2 are key, in my opinion, for us to help browsers standardize things. The first one is to create a constant virtuous cycle of feedback. So this is very important because it shows sort of in some standards like the web component spec why it took so long, because developers were not willing to kind of onboard and try the new things, and instead waited off, and so the browser vendors didn't get any feedback on standardizing this. And the other thing is that they're focusing on prioritizing efforts based on those recommendations that they're getting and deprioritizing others, which again kind of falls back into the same thing. If we want something to come and we want to have an impact, we need to give feedback. We need to try these things as soon as there's polyfills and things like that. But if you want to learn more about the kind of standardization process, you want to check out the talk from Monica Dinculescu about how the web sausage gets made from 2017. It's focusing especially on sort of how web components evolved over time, but it's overall a great talk to learn more about the Extensible Web Manifesto. The other thing is that if something gets standardized, it might not actually necessarily look the same way. So we already saw the example of Ajax turning into the fetch command that is promise-based so that it better integrates with the rest of the ecosystem and is more future-proof. The other example is require.js and common.js were around for quite a while until we got ES modules. And it looks significantly different, but it took kind of the asynchronous aspect of require.js and a couple of other concepts of common.js to merge them into something that made sense for the browser and ultimately for the ecosystem. One common one that I hear about, at least on Twitter a lot these days, is about the conversation about standardizing JSX. And at least in my personal opinion, JSX, for example, makes this fairly hard because by nature, JSX is rendering independent. We set the renderer to, during the compile time to JavaScript, and it just translates that to a bunch of function calls that we can use. And so we actually already have something that allows you to do that, where it's a bunch of, where you define a function and then that returns some output, and we can use it in an easy way with an arbitrary syntax. And that's tag templates. So we can create any sort of function that takes care of the input that we put in, allows us to interpolate values, and then create any output we want, be it a new string or anything else. And so Jason Miller, the creator of Preact, actually took that as an example and built HTM, which allows you to use React, Preact, or anything else as JSX-based without having to compile by using tag templates. And yes, the tooling is not as great right now around this as JSX might be around TypeScript and stuff like that. But that's because we're not heavily invested in this yet. And so again, unless we use things are not being built because the problem doesn't become big enough for people to solve it. But even if things don't get standardized, sometimes projects just drastically change or come to an end. So AngularJS is a great example. With React and other things coming around after 2010, the Angular team took some time and took a step back and looked at sort of what the current ecosystem is and wanted to create a new thing that solved their problems in a way that they thought it made sense. And so Angular 2 was a drastic rewrite of the way you would create applications. And frankly, that meant that some people moved off to React or Vue or other things because for them, ultimately, their problems aligned better with what React and Vue were trying to solve. And so often I see the kind of statement or hear it that Angular is dead. But Angular is very much not dead. The community just doesn't overlap much with the community that writes things like React. But in fact, I looked, there's, for example, 21 Angular-specific conferences in 2019 versus, I think I found 22 React conferences. And also, additionally to that, we tend to be in sort of our JavaScript bubble of people who are full-time JavaScript developers. But there's lots of other people who write JavaScript on a regular basis without identifying themselves as JavaScript developers, be it people who write .NET or Java or any other language. The other part of the kind of framework lifecycle I want to talk about is how frameworks inspire each other and learn from each other. I think one good example is the origin of Vue. So Vue was created by Evan You. At the time, he was working at Google, but or had just left Google, I think. And he was inspired by AngularJS because he had to build a lot of things with AngularJS, but he wanted to solve some of his own problems. And so to quote him, I wanted something that captured the declarative nature of Angular's data binding, but with a simpler and more approachable API. That's how Vue started. And so here we can see one of those classic examples is actually written down of how they inspired each other. But this is constantly happening in the ecosystem. Another example is Toolkits. I think we've all used something like a Vue CLI, Angular CLI, Preact CLI. There's lots of different CLIs around these days. But one of my favorite parts of inspiration here is I want to talk about the Angular CLI, or more specifically about the Ember CLI. Because until last year, there were plenty of references in the Angular CLI source code about Ember CLI, and that's because the Angular CLI started off with literally having the Ember CLI as a dependency. And so they took kind of inspiration one step further by relying on that and then building on top of that. But sometimes the inspiration also comes from the community. So if you didn't hear about the term ahead of time compiling, that's basically a technique that frameworks like Angular or Svelte use to remove, during like a compiling step, remove unnecessary code and improve the startup time and bundle size by removing parts of the library that are unnecessary. And so, inspired by that technique from Svelte, Tobias from the Webpack team actually built a proof of concept that did the same thing with React and called it RawAct, where it actually removes the VDOM implementation and a bunch of other things from React, and instead replaces that with direct rendering instructions for the DOM, which makes at least some applications way smaller. But this also gets me to the fact that like not everything works for every use case, because he points out in his repository that this is largely useful for things where your application has less components than the size of the React source code, or if you're trying to do things like building web components where you don't want to ship the entirety of React with every web component. So if you want to build a date picker, but you want to use React and then distribute it to everyone else, you can do that without having to distribute that. Also, a fair warning, the RawAct thing is very much a proof of concept. But I hope that React is picking that up over time. But that gets me to the fact that people just have different requirements and ultimately different backgrounds and different challenges they are trying to solve. And we tend to forget about that. A Java developer, for example, might feel more comfortable with the fact that how dependency injection works in Angular, or a .NET developer might feel more comfortable with an opinionated framework that tells them how to solve certain problems, because that's what they're used to. And an enterprise developer might have a better chance to use a framework that is batteries included, rather than having to go through approval for every single library that solves a small challenge instead. But as much as frameworks are about solving problems, they're also about hype. In fact, they're very much about hype. To quote Max Stoiber, making a popular open source project is 10% idea, 15% code, and 75% community building and marketing. And I think that's very true. By the way, if you don't know Max Stoiber, he created styled components, among other things. So he knows what he's talking about there. And I think two good examples are Aurelia and Svelte. Aurelia was created in 2015 by Rob Eisenberg, who had left the Angular team because he had some disagreement around the design decisions that the Angular team was doing. And so he created his own framework, and it's actually a really good framework that is being used. It's just not as widely known as Angular, for example, or React. And the other one is Svelte. And Svelte is a framework that has a lot of great concepts like the ahead of time compiling and others. And it might actually be useful for your own project, but chances are when you evaluated another framework, you might have just not heard about it and therefore didn't even take it into consideration. So hype really is what makes a framework. But less hype doesn't mean that it's killing the framework. And that gets me to one of, I think, like the one thing that I want you to take away from this talk, and that's let's not call frameworks dead. Because in JavaScript, nothing really ever dies. 70% of the top million websites still use jQuery. And things like Angular and Ember and others have vibrant communities. And by us talking about like a technology being dead, I feel like it's very disrespectful for the people who both still maintain these things, but also the people who have to work with them on a regular basis. But also, sometimes, yes, some frameworks go unmaintained, but that still doesn't mean that they're dead, because people don't have the luxury of being able to change overnight to a new framework. And so, as long as those tools still solve problems for people, the community likely is going to stick around. It might shrink in size, but that still doesn't mean that it's dead. And so I like the comparison of how frameworks and libraries are like hammers. There's like an unlimited amount of them, and they have different sizes, different manufacturers, and different specializations. But please don't tell someone to buy a new hammer Because if they already have one and it solves their problem because they only have to put a nail into a wall like once a month or once a year, don't tell them they need to drop their hammer because it's not efficient and they need to buy a new carpenter hammer. It's not their use case because they don't need it that often. So let's stop kind of making people feel bad about that. Let's stop telling people they are wasting their time, because ultimately, if they're happy with their solution, they're totally fine to keep using it. So let's not make them feel bad. All right, to wrap things up, I want to update an ask from Dan Abramov from 2016. And I want to update it to take some time and build a side project or something with a framework or a tool that you're not familiar with. And approach it with an open mind so that you can use the tools and the frameworks that they build around it, the philosophies of how they structure their applications, and learn from that. And then don't look down on others and try to convince them to change to your favorite tools. Instead, talk to each other. Talk about why they chose it and why you chose your solution, what they like and dislike about it. Share your own experiences and help each other and learn from each other. Because if frameworks can learn from each other and evolve, then you can too. All right, if you want to check out the slides, they're on this URL, and I'll tweet about them afterwards as well. And with that, I would like to say thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be around, so feel free to talk to me afterwards or hit me up on Twitter or via email. Thank you so much.